The air in the Cascades in November 1924 didn't just feel cold, it felt heavy. Wet. The smell of pine, sawdust, and exhaust from the donkey engine was our cologne, thick enough to taste. We were 7 miles deeper into the timber line than any crew had dared go since the Great Fire, pulling out the old-growth cedars that the previous generation had dismissed as too gnarly to bother with. Silas, the foreman, was a man carved out of the same dense wood we were cutting. 50 years old, a thick, permanent layer of dirt under his fingernails, and a continuous stream of brown tobacco juice staining the snow near his boots. He never talked much, just grunted orders and listened to the woods. Then there was Mickey, 19 years old, green as spring moss, always checking his pocket watch like time itself was about to run out on him. Mickey had read too many dime novels about the wilderness, and he kept looking over his shoulder toward the towering ridges, half expecting some forgotten prospector or maybe a mountain lion to jump him. We ragged on him, of course, telling him those old tales the tribal workers used to whisper, the stories about the Oma that walked like men but smelled like wet dog and rotten meat. Silas always spat and told us to shut up and swing the damn axes. Practicality was the only religion we had up there. Our routine was a brutal symphony of noise, the rhythmic thwack of the steel bite into the wood, the whine of the crosscut saw, the explosive snap of the cables, and finally, the colossal, shuddering crash as a 200-year-old giant met the dirt. That sound was usually followed by cheers and the metallic tang of cheap whiskey. But lately, the sounds were different. It started subtly. We noticed the usual background chatter of the forest had vanished. No squirrels, no jays screaming, just the wind cutting through the rigging and the sound of our own heavy breathing. Even the deer trails looked unused, the underbrush undisturbed for weeks. Silas noticed it too. I could tell, because he started sleeping with his hunting rifle propped against his bunk, something he hadn't done since his first wife ran off. He just attributed it to the change in weather, the cold driving the game lower down. But the weather hadn't changed that much. The unsettling quiet peaked yesterday, near sunset. We were felling a monster cedar, wider than any 2 men combined. It took us nearly 5 hours of exhausting, back-breaking work. When it finally went, it wasn't a clean fall. The base, already rotting slightly on the downhill side, splintered, tearing out a massive crater of earth and root structure, leaving a gaping wound in the forest floor. As the dust settled and the silence rushed back in, Silas motioned us over to inspect the damage. The tree's immense root ball had flipped up, revealing a patch of ground that had been sheltered from light and air for decades. But what lay beneath the exposed earth wasn't just dirt and rock. There was a depression, circular and deep, perfectly centered where the primary roots had been anchored. And in that depression, half buried in the freshly disturbed soil, was a mass of dark, thick hair, not animal fur, not really. It looked like matted horsehair, except it was impossibly coarse and smelled powerfully, sweetly, of ozone and something akin to stale sweat and old copper. Mickey dropped his saw. Silas's eyes narrowed, not with fear yet, but with the specific confusion a man gets when the rules of the world he knows suddenly stop applying. He nudged the mass of hair with the toe of his boot, and underneath it, we saw the rock, a massive slab of basalt that hadn't been blasted loose by the root ball, but had seemingly been placed there, and etched crudely into the flat surface of the basalt, as if scraped by something dull and incredibly strong, were 5 parallel lines, impossibly deep, running straight down into the dirt. Will stood there, the mud clinging to the worn leather of his gloves, staring down at the basalt. He wiped the sweat that had gone instantly cold on his brow. Those 5 gouges weren't made by a tool, and they certainly weren't natural stress fractures. They were too clean, too purposeful, and the pulverized rock dust still lay fresh at their edges. The mound, of course, what hair we'd first mistaken for moss, remained stuck to the stone surface, smelling faintly of old meat and damp wool. What in the hell scraped this? I muttered, my voice thin. The air temperature dropped so sharply it felt like walking into a meat locker. I could see my own breath, which was ridiculous. It was barely noon and the sun was high over the Cascades. The shift wasn't just thermal, it was acoustic. All the familiar, reassuring noise of the forest just ceased. The endless, insistent buzz of flies around the cook shack vanished. The distant, faint drone of the mill engine, miles downriver, seemed to cut out entirely. Even the wind, which usually sighed through the high pines with the sound of rushing water, went absolutely still. We were encased in a heavy, humid silence that pressed against the eardrums until they ached. It was the kind of silence you only find deep underwater. A tremor of unease ran through the three of us, standing by the uprooted stump. Will, who always claimed dynamite was the answer to every problem, reached for the heavy axe still lodged in the clay. Then the first sound came. It wasn't a growl or a scream, nothing dramatic. It was a rhythmic, incredibly deep thump. It came from upslope, where the stand of ancient cedars began, the virgin timber we hadn't touched yet. It sounded precisely like a 1,000-pound sledgehammer being swung into the trunk of a living tree, but duller, more resonant, and deliberate. Thump, pause, thump, pause, thump, thump, thump. The cadence was slow, brutal, and felt completely unnatural. It wasn't felling, it sounded like signaling. What was that? I whispered, glancing nervously at the dense shadow line of the untouched woods. Will spat a brown stream of tobacco juice onto the rock, narrowly missing the weird scoring. He had sweat running down his temples now, despite the cold, but his voice was firm, almost aggressively dismissive. It's the mountain, Pete. That's all it is. Pressure release. A big slab of granite finally settled. Or maybe the frost line shifted a few feet up there. Or hell, maybe it's just those damn rails expanding in the sun, rattling a bit. But the sun wasn't shining here anymore. The light had gone flat and gray, and the ground beneath us was vibrating with an impossibly low frequency that settled deep in the chest, giving everyone that familiar, awful, metallic taste of adrenaline in their mouths. And the sound didn't stop. It continued, a mile away and moving slowly, steadily closer. Whatever was doing the knocking, it was traveling downhill toward the clearing, and it clearly didn't care who heard it. The vibration finally bled out, replaced by a vacuum of silence, so absolute it felt like the mountain itself was holding its breath. We didn't talk about it that evening. We just ate the stew, cold now, tasting metallic, and pretended the kerosene lamps were bright enough to push back the pressing dark. But nobody was looking at the cards. They were looking past the light, into the black timberline 10 feet away. Sleep was a luxury none of us could afford. The bunkhouse smelled like sweat, stale coffee, and unwashed wool. Every man was a tightly wound spring. Billy, who usually slept like a felled redwood, started whimpering softly around midnight. He kept asking if we heard the dirt shifting outside. We didn't, but the seed was planted. We were all listening now, straining to hear the wrong kind of quiet. The next night, it didn't wait for dark. Just as the shadows started swallowing the logging path, the low thrumming started again, closer this time, maybe a quarter-mile away, moving parallel to the creek bed. Then came the sound we dreaded, the impact. Not a knock. This was the sound of something immense, wet, and heavy hitting a mature cedar trunk. Flumph. The shockwave actually rattled the glass in the single window of the cook shack. We all jumped up, knocking over our stools. Sam, usually the most steady hand, was already scrambling for his rifle, his eyes wide and unblinking. That was the breaking point. The veneer of civilization was cracking. We started snapping at each other, arguing over whether it was a grizzly or just a massive rock slide, though everyone knew it wasn't. Sam stopped eating. He just sat on his bunk, sharpening his hunting knife until the thin steel shone under the weak lamplight, staring at the forest line like a lover waits for a betrayal. The noises escalated. They became deliberate. It wasn't just percussion anymore. It was pacing. Heavy, wet footsteps circling the clearing after the fires died down, slow enough that you could count them. 1, 2 squelch. Then, the scratching started. It wasn't the tentative scrape of a raccoon. This was the sound of blunt, heavy claws dragging across the rough cedar siding of the bunkhouse, right next to where I slept. It sounded like someone trying to tear the wood apart with bare hands. I could hear the fibers screaming, and I swear I could smell something rank, like sour milk and wet dog fur, maybe a hint of fresh ozone just before a storm. I spent hours pressed against the wall, paralyzed, waiting for whatever was outside to realize how thin the wood was. The scratching would stop suddenly, replaced by a deep, hollow inhaling sound right outside the window, like the forest was trying to suck all the air out of the cabin. Sam, the man obsessed, just gripped his knife, whispering something about how it needed a name, how it was studying us. He looked less like a logger and physical blow. The air in the cabin felt thin, pressurized. I could hear Sam's ragged breathing, wet and shallow, beside me. We must have held that agonizing silence for 30, maybe 40 seconds, just listening to the old-growth forest creak under the immense weight of the cold night. Then came the smell. Not the usual damp earth and pine needle smell of the Cascades. This was thick, foul, and overwhelming. A stench of ammonia, stale sweat, and something utterly feral, like rotten meat left boiling in musk. It was the smell of something unbound by human constraint. Before I could even process the warning from my sinuses, the small, brittle glass pane in the window exploded inward. Not just broke, but detonated, accompanied by the horrific sound of 2-inch thick cedar planks rending like paper. A colossal shape blotted out the darkness framed by the shattered opening. It wasn't just big, it was disproportionate, a towering, hulking mass of knotted muscle and dark, matted hair that seemed to absorb the meager moonlight. My vision narrowed instantly, focusing only on the thing's hand. Not a paw, but a hand, wide as a dinner plate, the knuckles thick and gnarled, covered in coarse, oily black hair. The skin visible between the hair looked taut and gray. One enormous finger, tipped with a dirty, yellowed nail like an oyster shell, swept across the inside window ledge, dragging along Sam's map and compass, sending them spinning into the shadows. I didn't scream. I couldn't. Fear didn't manifest as flight. It manifested as cold, absolute certainty that the world I knew had just been violently replaced. My jaw locked so hard I tasted blood, a metallic tang on my tongue. I was looking at something that should not exist, a relic of an age we had civilized away, and it was looking back with eyes I could not make out, only sensing the weight of its observation. Sam, however, did not freeze. He bellowed, a sound half-prayer, half-insane challenge, and lunged. It sees us. It knows us. He scrambled forward, not aiming for escape, but for contact. He rammed the tip of his sharpened logging knife, his god, as he called it, right through the gap where the window frame used to be. There was a sound like stabbing a side of beef, a wet, sickening thud, followed by a roar that was less animal and more geological, shaking the very foundations of the small structure. The hand recoiled instantly, but it wasn't fear in the creature's reaction. It was outrage and colossal pain. The whole cabin lifted slightly on its foundation, slammed by a blow from outside, pitching me forward onto the floor. Splinters rained down from the ceiling. We heard heavy, pounding steps receding into the trees, steps that sounded too heavy for mere flesh and bone, steps that belonged to a collapsing cliff. I lay there, deafened, smelling the ozone and the fresh blood now mixed with that terrible musk. Sam was sobbing, clutching the floorboards, his sanity utterly shattered by the moment of divine, horrific contact. We had provoked a titan. We weren't loggers sharing the woods. We were vermin hiding in a box, and it had finally decided to crush us. I grabbed Sam's shoulder, hauling him toward the back wall. He was a dead weight, his soiled trousers scraping the splintered floorboards, emitting that sickly sweet odor of fear and waste. The silence outside was heavier than the pounding had been, a suffocating blanket that meant the thing was listening, processing. I didn't care that my ribs felt like they were sawing through my lungs. I had to reach the truck. I kicked the rear window out, shards of cold glass showering us both. The air that rushed and smelled of fresh night dampness, ozone, and the coppery tang of my own fear. I dragged Sam out into the muddy clearing. The truck was 20 feet away, a dark, rusting silhouette. Every step I took felt like I was wading through quicksand. Every shallow breath scraped my throat raw. I didn't dare look into the shadows beneath the towering firs. I just focused on the cold steel of the truck bed. I wrestled Sam into the passenger seat, ignoring his whimpering. It was nothing but background noise now. I slid behind the wheel, my hands slick with sweat and grime, feeling for the ignition. The old Model T needed the crank, but I tried the key first, jamming it in, twisting. The starter whined, thin and weak, mocking our desperation. VVRRR. Silence. I reached for the crank handle, my muscles screaming in protest. As I fitted the iron handle into the slot on the front grille, I heard it. Not the steps this time. It was a sound like a great canvas sail snapping taut in a gale, followed by a wet, deep inhalation. It was right there, beyond the weak spill of the headlights. I didn't see the shape, but the heat radiating from the darkness, a massive, sickening wave of animal heat and musk, was unmistakable. I cranked the engine handle, throwing my full weight into it. Once, twice, the starter coughs, refusing to catch. My shoulder socket screamed, the pain shooting down to my fingertips. I cranked again. That's when Sam suddenly came alive, snapping out of his catatonia not with reason, but with pure, white-hot panic. He didn't look at me. He looked straight ahead, his eyes wide and black in the dim light. He screamed, a high, piercing, inhuman sound that ripped through the oppressive quiet, and threw himself at his door handle. I heard the tearing sound before I could stop him, a splintering crunch of metal and wood as the passenger side door was ripped from its hinges. There was no blow, no roar, just a sudden, powerful stillness, and then the wet, horrible sound of dense flesh being clamped down upon. Sam's scream cut off instantly, replaced by a gurgling, wet shriek of displaced air and blood. The distraction bought me 3 seconds. 3 seconds I used to throw my entire body weight onto the crank one last time. The engine caught with a deafening, rattling roar that smelled of gasoline and hot oil. I didn't look across the seat. I couldn't look at the gaping, empty space where Sam had been. I slammed the truck into gear, the tires spitting gravel and mud, fishtailing violently as I mashed the accelerator pedal. The smell of hot blood and fresh viscera mingled with the exhaust fumes, a sickening perfume of death that clung to the cab. I drove blind, leaning on the horn, tearing the truck through saplings and underbrush, the high beams bouncing wildly, transforming the surrounding forest into a chaotic, terrifying blur of black and white. Behind me, the roar of the engine was suddenly replaced by a heavy, wet thump, followed by a noise like a tree trunk being dragged rapidly through dense snow. It was gaining. I gripped the wheel until my knuckles were white, driving toward any flicker of road, fleeing the woods and the absolute certainty that I was the only thing left alive carrying the story. I didn't stop driving until the sun was a painful, blinding wedge of light splitting the horizon, and the sharp, clean smell of pine and wet earth was replaced by the thin, metallic tang of civilization. The old truck's engine seized about 20 miles outside of Easton, steaming violently. I stumbled out, collapsing onto the greasy asphalt, tasting nothing but bile and the coppery fear that had coated my mouth for hours. For the first time, the woods were behind me, but the silence, the sudden, artificial silence of the open road, was louder than any roar. Of the 11 men who went into the higher logging camps that season, only 3 of us came back out. Myself, Silas, and young Pete. Silas was found 2 days later by a search party, wandering naked near a creek bed, singing nursery rhymes to the stones. He never spoke a coherent word again, just stared up at the ceiling of the asylum ward until he died 3 weeks later, his eyes wide, fixed on something none of us could see. Pete, who was only 19, lives in the state institution now. He doesn't recognize his family. He only screams when the weather changes, when the wind outside the window rattles the glass, sounding faintly like something dragging heavy timber across frozen ground. The police investigation was a joke. They treated us like shell-shocked drunks, rambling about a fever dream fueled by bad moonshine. They blamed a rogue grizzly, perhaps a severe case of shared delirium. They found nothing. They found no bodies. The mountains, I learned, are very efficient at consuming evidence, save for the shredded remains of Billy's waxed canvas jacket, scattered impossibly high in a fir tree. They officially closed the file under unexplained disappearance and severe localized psychological distress. They called our claims bush fever delirium, a convenient label for an inconvenient, terrifying truth. I carry the weight of those woods every day. The sounds of the city, the streetcars, the distant shouts, the factory whistles, are all flimsy, temporary noises. They mask the profound silence I know exists right beneath them. I know what I saw in that clearing, and I know what chased my truck. It wasn't a bear, not some evolutionary cousin lost to time. It moved with intelligence, with a predatory patience, and with a kind of ancient, terrible gravity that belongs not to the natural world, but to something much older, much darker. I wake up soaked in sweat, listening for the sound of branches snapping, even though I live on the third floor of a brick building miles from the nearest forest. They think the light is just wrong and the air turns thin and smells faintly of ozone and wet fur. I swear I can hear the heavy, measured rhythm of its footfalls echoing, not in the mountains, but right beneath the floorboards of my own